I didn't find out from my son, I found out by accident, the way you learn things when you no longer matter enough to be told. The house was quiet that morning, and for the first time, the silence felt intentional. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea that had already gone cold, listening to the refrigerator hum, when my phone lit up with a message that wasn't meant for me. It was a forwarded photo from someone I barely spoke to, a casual thing, sent without thought. My son was in it. His wife was beside him. Around them were her parents, her brothers, her sisters, all pressed together with the relaxed closeness of people who had planned something together. They were smiling in an airport, jackets on, bags at their feet, faces turned toward a future that did not include me. I remember noticing how neat everything looked, how certain. I remember thinking that certainty must be a luxury you earn when you no longer have to explain yourself to your mother. I set the phone down carefully, as if it were fragile, and waited for a feeling to arrive. Nothing dramatic came. There was no rush of tears, no anger, no sharp intake of breath. What came instead was a small, precise understanding that settled into my chest and stayed there. I had not been forgotten by accident. I had been left out on purpose. That difference mattered more than I wanted it to. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and placed it upside down on the towel. The house seemed to watch me, patient and familiar, as if it had seen this kind of quiet before and knew how it ended. I had lived in that house for decades, long enough to know which floorboard sighed near the hallway and which window whistled when the wind came from the east. After my husband died, the rooms had adjusted to my single presence. They learned my habits. The house learned when I woke and when I slept, learned the sound of my slippers in the morning and the way I paused at the stairs when my knees were tired. When my son married and moved back in, the house learned again. It learned doors closing softly, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, laughter that belonged to someone else. I told myself that was normal. Young couples needed privacy. Mothers needed to step back. I stepped back so far I sometimes felt I was standing outside my own life, looking in through a window. Loneliness doesn't announce itself. It changes the way you do small things. You stop asking questions because the answers feel like interruptions. You eat dinner earlier because no one else is hungry. You learn the difference between being alone and being unnecessary, and you don't talk about it because you aren't sure anyone would listen. I had become very good at making myself easy to overlook. I kept the house clean, I stayed quiet, I paid bills without mentioning them. I told myself that love meant endurance, that if I stayed useful, I would stay included. It seemed like a fair trade at the time. There had been signs before that morning, moments that didn't sit right but that I pushed aside. Whispered conversations in the evenings, luggage appearing and disappearing from the hall closet. My son answering his phone in another room, his voice lowered in a way that made it clear the conversation was not meant for me. When I asked simple questions, the answers were brief, unfinished. We'll see, maybe, later. I learned not to press. Pressing made me feel foolish, like a child asking for attention at the wrong time. His wife had never been unkind to me directly. She was careful about that. Polite, efficient. She thanked me when it suited her and ignored me when it didn't. I told myself that was her personality, that not everyone showed warmth the same way. My son seemed happy with her, and I wanted that for him more than I wanted my own comfort. I had raised him to build a life of his own. I just hadn't expected that life to close its doors so quietly behind him. After I saw the photograph, I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom. The bed was made neatly, the way I always kept it, untouched. I had learned to keep rooms ready even when no one came. There was a suitcase on the top shelf of the closet, mine, the one I used years ago when my husband and I traveled together. I hadn't touched it in a long time. I closed the door and went back downstairs, feeling older than I had the night before. I did not call my son that day. I did not ask where they were going or when they would be back. I told myself there would be time later, that explanations would come on their own. There are moments when silence feels safer than the truth. I spent the afternoon doing ordinary things. I folded laundry, I watered the plants, I made soup and froze half of it because I had learned to cook for one without thinking about it. Every so often, my mind drifted back to the image on my phone, to the way everyone else in that picture seemed to know exactly where they were going. That night, I sat alone in the living room with the lights low, listening to the clock on the wall mark time. I wondered how long this trip had been planned. I wondered who knew and who didn't. I wondered when my role in my son's life shifted from participant to afterthought. These were questions I did not want answered yet. They felt dangerous, like pulling on a loose thread when you're not ready to see what unravels. When I went to bed, the house creaked in its familiar way, settling around me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling a quiet pressure build inside my chest. It wasn't grief, it wasn't anger, it was something else, something steadier and more unsettling. It was the sense that a line had been crossed without my knowledge, that decisions had been made in rooms where my name was no longer spoken. I fell asleep thinking about that silence, about how easily it had been arranged, and knowing without yet understanding how, that it would not be the last time I felt it. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, the way I often did now. Age does that to you. Sleep becomes lighter, less forgiving. I lay still for a while, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere outside, a bird called once and then stopped. I reached for my phone without thinking, half expecting a message that would explain everything. There was nothing. No apology, no update, no casual note saying they had decided to travel last minute. The absence felt deliberate again, like a door quietly closed. I moved through my morning slowly. I made oatmeal and ate it standing at the counter, the spoon tapping softly against the bowl. I washed the dishes immediately, as if leaving them might suggest someone else was coming along to help later. I straightened the cushions on the sofa, even though no one had sat on them. These habits had become a way of keeping myself occupied, of filling space that used to be filled by conversation. I told myself that when they came back, things would return to normal. That thought felt thin, but I held on to it anyway. Days passed like that, quiet ones, the kind that slip by unnoticed unless you're paying attention. I went to the grocery store and bought only what I needed, even though I still caught myself reaching for items my son liked. I put them back carefully, feeling faintly embarrassed, as if someone were watching. In the evenings, I sat in my chair and read, but the words blurred together. My attention kept drifting to the hallway, to the sound of the front door that never came. It occurred to me more than once that I did not know how long they planned to be gone. That detail, too, had not been shared. When they finally returned, it was late in the evening. I heard the car first, tires crunching softly on the gravel. Laughter drifted in through the open windows, unfamiliar voices mixed with my son's. I stayed where I was, seated in the living room with the lamp on, my book open but unread. I did not know whether to greet them or wait. By the time I decided, they were already inside, arms full of bags, energy filling the house in a way that felt intrusive rather than comforting. My son looked surprised to see me, as if he hadn't considered where I might be. His wife smiled politely and turned back to unpacking. Someone I recognized as her sister glanced at me briefly and then away. There were hugs exchanged among them, stories beginning and overlapping, references to moments I could not place. I stood up slowly and said hello. My voice sounded thinner than usual. No one answered right away. When my son finally did, it was distracted, already turning back toward his wife. "We're exhausted," he said, as if that explained everything. I waited for an invitation that didn't come. No one asked if I wanted to hear about the trip. No one said they wished I could have been there. I watched them move through the kitchen, opening cabinets, laughing about something that had happened at the airport. They spoke freely, comfortably, like people who had rehearsed this version of themselves without me. I realized then that this was not a single event. It was a pattern I had been stepping around for some time, careful not to disturb it. Later that night, after the house settled again, I heard my son and his wife talking in their room. Their voices were low, but not careful. My name came up once, then again. I did not mean to listen, but the walls were thin, and I was tired of pretending not to hear what was obvious. They were discussing money, bills, plans. My son sounded irritated, his wife practical. They spoke about me as if I were a factor, not a person, something to be managed. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded in my lap, feeling a strange mix of clarity and disbelief. I had known for a while that I was being taken for granted. Hearing it spoken so plainly was different. The next day, my son approached me in the kitchen. He stood where my husband used to stand, leaning against the counter, eyes fixed on a spot just over my shoulder. He asked how I was, the question rushed, already answered in his mind. Then he mentioned expenses from the trip, flights, hotels, unexpected costs. He spoke casually, as if continuing a conversation we had already agreed on. I nodded, though he hadn't actually asked for anything yet. The request hovered between us, unspoken but inevitable. I thought about the photograph again, about how easy it had been for him to plan a trip that excluded me, about how difficult it seemed for him to look me in the eye now. I realized then that I had become a convenience, a solution to problems he did not want to solve himself. I did not say no, I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I told him I would need time to think. The look on his face shifted slightly, a flicker of annoyance quickly covered by a smile. "Of course," he said, already stepping away. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the block. It was something I had started doing more often, a way to remind myself that the world still existed beyond my front door. I watched other people go about their lives, couples arguing quietly, children tugging at parents' hands. I wondered how many of them felt invisible inside their own families. That thought stayed with me as I returned home, as I unlocked the door to a house that felt less like shelter and more like a waiting room. That night I lay awake again, listening to familiar sounds that no longer comforted me. I understood finally that what hurt most was not the trip itself, but what it represented. Decisions made without me, futures imagined without my presence. I sensed that something was shifting, something that would not return to its old shape. I did not yet know what I would do with that knowledge. I only knew that pretending nothing had changed was becoming harder with each passing day. A few days later, my son mentioned a wedding as if it were an afterthought. He said it while scrolling on his phone, not looking at me, his voice casual and distracted. A cousin on his wife's side was getting married, somewhere warm, somewhere I had never been. He said it would be a big event, lots of family, lots of planning. I waited, thinking there might be more, an invitation perhaps, or at least a pause that suggested my presence mattered. Instead, he nodded to himself and added that they would probably be gone for several days. That was it. The sentence ended there, leaving me standing in the kitchen with my hands resting on the counter, feeling as if I had misheard something important. I asked, carefully, whether it was something I should prepare for. My voice sounded neutral, practiced. He glanced up then, surprised again, as if my question hadn't occurred to him. He hesitated just long enough to make me uncomfortable. "Well," he said, "it's mostly her side of the family." He didn't say no outright. He didn't say yes either. He simply returned to his phone, the conversation already over. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to the sink. I told myself not to read into it. That had become one of my strongest skills. In the days that followed, details of the wedding drifted through the house without ever landing on me directly. I heard dates mentioned in passing. I saw a garment bag appear in the hallway closet. I noticed my son's wife making lists at the dining table, her handwriting quick and decisive. No one asked me what I would be doing while they were away. No one asked if I needed anything. It was assumed I would manage, the way I always had. That assumption carried more weight than any spoken exclusion. One afternoon, a formal envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to my son and his wife, their names written in careful script. I held it for a moment before placing it on the table where they usually sorted their mail. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Later, when they were both home, I watched from the doorway as it was opened. I saw the card inside, the elegant lettering, the location printed at the top. I waited for someone to look up at me to explain. No one did. My son's wife smiled and said something about seating arrangements. My son nodded. That was when I understood. This wasn't an oversight, it was a decision. That evening, I sat alone in the living room while they discussed travel plans in the kitchen. I could hear them clearly. They spoke about flights, about hotel rooms, about who would share rides from the airport. Names were listed. Everyone seemed accounted for. I was not mentioned once. I tried to remember the last time I had been invited without having to ask first. The memory didn't come easily. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected. That morning, the house buzzed with activity. Suitcases rolled across the floor. The bathroom door stayed closed longer than usual. I made coffee and drank it quietly at the table, watching them move around me. At one point, my son's wife asked if I could feed the neighbor's cat while they were gone. The request was made politely, efficiently, as if this were my role now. I agreed without hesitation. It felt easier than pointing out the irony. Before they left, my son paused near the door. For a moment, I thought he might say something, that he might notice the way I stood there with my hands folded, already alone. Instead, he reminded me to keep an eye on the house and to let him know if any bills came in. Then he was gone, following his wife down the steps, their voices fading together. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. I did not cry right away. I cleaned the kitchen. I wiped down the counters. I put away the cups they had used. The routine steadied me. Only later, when I sat down in my bedroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror, did something inside me loosen. I looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I wondered when I had started shrinking myself to fit into corners of my own life. In the days that followed, details of the wedding drifted through the house without ever landing on me directly. I heard dates mentioned in passing. I saw a garment bag appear in the hallway closet. I noticed my son's wife making lists at the dining table, her handwriting quick and decisive. No one asked me what I would be doing while they were away. No one asked if I needed anything. It was assumed I would manage, the way I always had. That assumption carried more weight than any spoken exclusion. During the days they were away, I kept busy. I watered plants. I walked the neighbor's street to feed the cat. I went to the library and sat among strangers who did not know my history. It was oddly comforting. No one expected anything from me there. Still, in quiet moments, my mind returned to the wedding. I imagined the ceremony, the photographs, the speeches. I imagined my son standing among people who celebrated him, people who knew him as he was now. I wondered if anyone asked about me. I suspected they didn't. When they returned, they brought gifts, small items wrapped neatly, placed on the table in front of me, a scarf, a magnet, things chosen quickly, without much thought. I thanked them, and they smiled, relieved. The exchange felt like a transaction completed. That night, I overheard stories from the wedding, laughter spilling down the hallway. I learned about moments I hadn't witnessed, jokes I didn't understand. Each story reinforced what I already knew. I was no longer part of the narrative they were building. Lying in bed later, listening to the house settle, I felt something harden quietly inside me. Not anger, not resentment, something more stable than that, a recognition. I had been patient, I had been accommodating, I had been silent, and still the distance had grown. I began to wonder for the first time whether continuing this way was costing me more than it was worth. The thought frightened me, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. I fell asleep knowing that something had shifted again and that ignoring it would no longer be possible. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later, not to me, but to the house. It was slipped through the mail slot on a quiet afternoon, landing on the floor with a soft sound I almost missed. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands before reading it, already aware that whatever was inside would not be meant for me. My son's name was written clearly on the front, his wife's beside it, the ink careful and deliberate. I placed it on the table and waited until evening, until they were both home, until there was no avoiding the moment. When it was opened, I watched from the doorway again, my presence polite and unobtrusive. It was for a large family celebration tied to the wedding, a dinner meant to gather everyone who mattered. The date was circled. Plans were made immediately. No one looked up at me. No one paused to consider whether I belonged in that circle. That night, I asked directly for the first time in years. My voice did not shake. I asked whether I should plan to attend. The room went still in a way that felt rehearsed. My son's wife answered first, smiling thinly, explaining that space would be limited, that it was really meant for close family. The word hung there, sharp and precise. Close. My son nodded beside her, his eyes fixed on the table, as if agreement were easier than honesty. I nodded too, because that is what I had always done. But something inside me finally cracked, quietly, without drama. I felt it like the sound of ice breaking far away. The day of the dinner, I stayed home. I cooked a small meal and ate it alone, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. I told myself it was only one evening. That thought no longer comforted me. When they returned late that night, their voices were loud with wine and laughter. I heard them recount moments from the dinner, the jokes, the speeches, the way everyone had gathered for photographs. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a dull ache settle behind my eyes. It was not jealousy. It was the slow realization that I had been moved out of frame. After that, the requests began to come more often. They arrived casually, wrapped in familiarity. Could I cover a bill that hadn't been expected? Could I handle a payment until the next paycheck? Could I lend a card, just for a little while? Each request was accompanied by reassurance, by promises of repayment that sounded sincere in the moment. I agreed because it felt easier than refusing, because I still believed that helping meant belonging. Over time, I stopped keeping track of what I gave. I told myself it didn't matter. Family doesn't count, I reminded myself. Family doesn't keep score. One afternoon, I overheard something I was not meant to hear. I had come down the stairs quietly, distracted by my own thoughts, when I heard my name spoken in a tone that made me pause. They were in the living room, voices low but careless. My son sounded irritated. His wife sounded amused. They were talking about expenses, about plans, about how things would be easier once certain obstacles were handled. I understood then that I was one of those obstacles. I stood on the stair, invisible, listening as they discussed me as if I were a resource rather than a person. There was no cruelty in their voices. That was what frightened me most. It was practical, normal, as if this arrangement had been decided long ago. I went back upstairs without announcing myself. My heart beat steadily, too steadily, as if it had already accepted the truth. I sat on the edge of my bed and folded my hands together the way I had done so many times when I needed to think clearly. I did not cry. I felt strangely calm, as if the last illusion I had been holding on to had finally fallen away. I realized then that waiting for things to improve was a choice I had been making every day, and that choice had a cost. A few days later, there was a family gathering at the house. Relatives from her side came over, filling the rooms with unfamiliar voices and confident laughter. I moved through the space quietly, refilling drinks, clearing plates, listening more than speaking. Conversations flowed around me without including me. At one point, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in the glass of a cabinet. I looked like a guest in my own home. The thought stayed with me long after the house emptied again. That evening, after everyone had gone, my son approached me with another request. He spoke gently, almost kindly, explaining a situation that required immediate help. He did not ask how I felt. He did not acknowledge the gathering, the way I had been overlooked. He simply assumed, as he always had, that I would say yes. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw a man who no longer saw me clearly at all. I told him I needed time. The silence that followed was brief but telling. His patience thinned, his expression hardened slightly. He said nothing more and walked away. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat there in the quiet, listening to the house settle around me. I thought about the years I had spent accommodating, adjusting, minimizing myself to keep peace. I thought about the invitations not offered, the decisions made without me, the way my presence had become optional. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had avoided for too long. What would happen if I stopped making myself available? The idea frightened me, not because of what I might lose, but because of what I might finally see. I lay down that night with the question unanswered, knowing only that the path I was on could not continue unchanged, and that something irreversible had begun to take shape inside me. After that night, I began to notice everything. Not in a dramatic way, not like someone searching for evidence, but with the quiet attention that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. I noticed how my son no longer asked how my day had been, only whether the mail had come. I noticed how his wife spoke to me only when something was needed, her tone polite but distant, as if we were neighbors rather than family. I noticed how decisions were made in low voices behind closed doors, and how those doors seemed to close more often now. None of it was new. What was new was that I no longer rushed to excuse it. I kept my routines. I woke early, I made my tea, I sat by the window and watched the street come alive. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, something had shifted its weight. I stopped offering help before it was requested. I stopped volunteering information about my schedule, my finances, my plans. It wasn't defiance, it was conservation. I was tired in a way rest could not fix, and I sensed that whatever energy I had left needed to be guarded carefully. The requests still came, though less smoothly now. My son would hover near the doorway, mentioning a problem without quite asking for a solution. His wife would sigh loudly at the table, her pen tapping against paper as if the sound itself were meant to summon me. Sometimes I helped, sometimes I said I would think about it. Each time I delayed, I felt their impatience more clearly. It was subtle, but it was there, like a draft you feel before you see the open window. One afternoon, I went through a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It held old papers, receipts, envelopes from banks and offices that no longer existed. I told myself I was just organizing. I had always been good at that, sorting, labeling, putting things in order. It calmed me. As I worked, I came across documents that reminded me of how much responsibility I had quietly carried over the years. Bills I had paid, repairs I had handled, decisions I had made without ever announcing them. I realized how little of that had been acknowledged, how easy it had been for others to step into the comfort those choices provided. That evening, there was an argument between my son and his wife. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. I heard my name again, this time spoken with frustration. He sounded torn. She sounded certain. They were discussing timing, pressure, what could wait and what could not. I stood in the hallway, unseen, my hand resting against the wall to steady myself. I understood enough to know that I was being measured, evaluated for usefulness, for how much longer I could be relied upon without resistance. The thought settled heavily in my chest. I went back to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and stared at the familiar objects around me. The dresser my husband and I had bought together, the lamp that had always stayed on late when my son was a teenager studying for exams. This room held decades of care, of presence, of waiting, and yet lately it felt temporary, like a space I was borrowing rather than inhabiting. I wondered when that had happened. I wondered how long I had been preparing myself for a departure I hadn't yet admitted was coming. In the days that followed, I practiced being quiet in a new way, not the silence of endurance, but the silence of observation. I listened carefully. I watched how they spoke to each other when they thought I wasn't around. I paid attention to what was assumed and what was requested. Patterns became clear. I began to understand that nothing would change on its own. Waiting would only make things easier for them, not for me. One morning, my son asked me, casually, whether I planned to stay in the house long term. The question was framed as concern, but it landed like a test. I answered honestly that I hadn't decided. He nodded, but his expression tightened. I could see calculations moving behind his eyes. That was when I felt a calm settle over me, the kind that arrives when you finally accept what you have been avoiding. I did not explain myself. I did not reassure him. I simply let the uncertainty exist. I began to spend more time outside the house. I walked longer routes, I sat in parks and watched people who did not know me, did not need anything from me. I visited the library and read in quiet corners where no one interrupted my thoughts. These small escapes reminded me that my world did not have to be limited to the walls I had been shrinking within. They reminded me that I was still capable of choosing where to place my attention. At home, the tension grew, though no one named it. My son grew shorter with me, his wife grew colder. The ease they once assumed was no longer guaranteed, and it unsettled them. I noticed how quickly patience disappeared when compliance was no longer automatic. I noticed how concern surfaced only when control felt uncertain. These observations did not make me angry. They made me resolute in a way I had never felt before. Late one night, unable to sleep, I stood in the hallway and looked around the house. I touched the wall lightly, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingers. This place held my history, but it no longer held my future. The realization was both painful and relieving. I understood then that endurance had reached its limit, that whatever came next would require intention, not hope. I returned to my room and lay down, my heart steady, my mind alert. I did not yet know how things would unfold. I only knew that I had stopped waiting for permission to matter, and that knowledge, once settled, would not be undone. By then, the house no longer felt neutral. It reacted to moods, to silences, to the careful way words were chosen and withheld. Mornings carried a tightness that hadn't been there before. My son moved through the kitchen quickly, avoiding eye contact, his patience thinner than he realized. His wife stopped pretending entirely. She no longer masked her irritation when I was slow to respond or hesitant to agree. I noticed how often she sighed when I entered a room, how conversations shifted as if someone had turned a dial. None of it was overt enough to confront. That was the problem. It lived in the space between things, where doubt could grow unchecked. I kept my voice even. I answered questions briefly. I did not offer explanations. This change unsettled them more than any argument would have. They were used to my availability, to my willingness to fill gaps without being asked. When that stopped, the house felt off balance. I could sense it in the way my son lingered near me sometimes, as if deciding whether to push or retreat. I could sense it in the way his wife watched me now, her gaze more calculating than dismissive. One evening, as we sat in separate rooms pretending not to notice one another, I heard them arguing again. This time, the words were sharper, less careful. Stress had worn away their restraint. I caught fragments as I passed the hallway. Deadlines, pressure, expectations. My name surfaced again, followed by a sentence that made my steps slow. My son said something about how much easier things would be if I were more cooperative. The words settled heavily in my chest. Cooperative? As if I were an obstacle to be managed, not a mother who had given him everything without question. I returned to my room and closed the door. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had been happening without softening it. I had not misunderstood. I had not been too sensitive. The pattern was clear now, and clarity brought with it a quiet resolve. I understood that kindness, when unprotected, becomes permission. From that point on, I began preparing myself internally, though nothing outwardly changed. I still cooked, I still cleaned, I still paid attention to the rhythms of the house, but I also began to detach in small, deliberate ways. I stopped centering my day around their needs. I let requests sit unanswered longer. I allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. Each time I did, I felt a small release, as if I were reclaiming pieces of myself that had been given away too easily. I spent more time alone with my thoughts. I revisited memories I had avoided, moments when my boundaries had been crossed without resistance. I thought about my husband, about the way he used to say that love should never require you to disappear. I realized how far I had drifted from that belief, how survival had slowly replaced dignity, one compromise at a time. One afternoon, my son asked me outright whether I trusted them. The question startled me with its directness. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I said I trusted actions more than words. He frowned, clearly unsatisfied, and walked away. That exchange stayed with me. It confirmed what I already knew. Trust to him meant access. It meant compliance, and my hesitation felt like a threat. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Small disagreements escalated more quickly. My son's patience frayed. His wife stopped pretending to include me in even minor decisions. Meals were eaten separately more often than not. I felt myself becoming a presence they had to navigate around rather than a person they considered. Strangely, that hurt less than it once would have. Distance brought clarity, and clarity, though painful, was stabilizing. Late one night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house quietly, turning off lights that had been left on, straightening cushions that didn't need straightening. These habits had always been comforting. That night, they felt like a farewell, though I didn't yet name it as such. I paused in the living room and looked around at the furniture, the photographs on the walls, the familiar arrangement of objects that told the story of my life. I realized that memory and belonging are not the same thing. One can exist without the other. In the weeks that followed, the pressure increased. My son became more insistent, his requests less masked. His wife stopped asking entirely and began assuming. I felt their frustration grow as my responses remained calm but non-committal. They were running out of patience. I could feel it. And with that realization came another, quieter one. So was I. One evening, my son brought up the subject of the house itself. He spoke carefully, framing the conversation as concern for the future, for planning ahead. He mentioned how difficult it might be for me to maintain the place alone, how things would be simpler if responsibilities were shared differently. His words were measured, but the intention beneath them was not. I listened without interrupting, my face neutral. When he finished, I told him I would think about it. The disappointment on his face was immediate. It flickered there before he could hide it. After he left the room, I sat alone in the quiet. I felt no panic, no confusion, only a steady awareness that the ground beneath me was shifting and that I could either be pushed or choose where to stand. I did not yet know exactly what form that choice would take. I only knew that the life I had been living was no longer sustainable, and that whatever came next would require courage I had been postponing. As I turned off the light and went to bed, I felt the weight of that understanding settle in fully. There was no turning back now, only forward into something uncertain but undeniably necessary. The clarity came quietly, the way most important things do at my age, not with panic or anger, but with a steady sense of inevitability. A week after that conversation about the house, I went to the bank on a morning when the sky was overcast and the air felt heavy. I told no one where I was going. I didn't dress differently or prepare myself with rehearsed words. I simply went, carrying my purse the way I always did, my posture straight, my expression calm. To anyone watching, it would have looked like an ordinary errand, and that was exactly the point. The bank lobby smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. I had been there many times before, usually to deposit checks or ask simple questions. This time, I asked to speak with someone privately. The young man who escorted me to a small office smiled politely, unaware of the weight I carried with me. I sat down and placed my documents on the desk one by one, hand steady, voice clear. I did not rush. I asked questions. I listened carefully to the answers. I took notes. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully present in my own life. What I learned that morning was not shocking, but it was sobering. I learned how exposed I had become without realizing it, how easily access had been granted, assumptions made, permissions implied through silence rather than consent. I learned what could be done and what could not, what required signatures and what required resolve. As the conversation unfolded, I felt something inside me settle into place. This was not revenge, it was correction. It was me restoring balance where it had quietly tipped too far. After the bank, I walked a few blocks and sat on a bench, letting the noise of the city wash over me. Cars passed, people hurried by with purpose, their lives moving forward without hesitation. I realized then how long I had been standing still, waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. That waiting had cost me more than time, it had cost me agency. Sitting there, watching the world continue, I understood that no one was coming to return that to me. I would have to take it back myself. In the days that followed, I made more appointments, quiet ones, necessary ones. I spoke to professionals who explained things without judgment. I listened. I asked for clarification. I signed nothing until I fully understood what it meant. Each meeting left me feeling lighter, not because the decisions were easy, but because they were mine. For the first time in years, I was not reacting, I was acting. At home, nothing appeared different. That was intentional. I continued my routines, I cooked meals, I answered questions when asked, I remained calm, attentive, polite. My son and his wife grew restless. I could sense it in the way they watched me now, trying to read meaning into my silence. They were used to knowing where I stood, to anticipating my responses. My unpredictability unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. One afternoon, I received a call while I was alone in the house. I closed the door to my room before answering. The conversation was brief but decisive. When I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the reality of it settle in. My heart beat evenly. There was no rush of triumph, no surge of fear, only a deep, grounding certainty. Something irreversible had been set in motion, and for the first time, that knowledge did not frighten me. The day I signed the final documents, the sun was out. I remember that clearly. Light streamed through the windows of the office, catching dust in the air. The pen felt heavier than I expected when I picked it up. I paused for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the life I was closing. Then I signed. My name looked unfamiliar on the page, steadier than it had been in years. When it was done, I placed the pen down and felt a quiet release move through me. Not joy, not sadness, relief. I did not tell my son that day, or the next, or the one after that. There was no rule that said I had to announce my decisions before they took effect. I had spent too many years explaining myself to people who only listened when it suited them. This time, I allowed the process to unfold without interference. I packed small things first, items that held personal meaning but would not be noticed immediately. A few books, old photographs, the scarf I had received after the wedding. Each object placed carefully into a box felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When the reality finally surfaced, it did so abruptly. A letter arrived addressed to me, official and unmistakable. My son opened it by mistake, assuming, as he always had, that what was mine was also his. I heard his voice change as he read. The house filled with a tension so sharp it was almost audible. He came to me with the paper in his hand, confusion and disbelief crossing his face. He asked questions quickly, one after another, his voice rising despite his effort to remain calm. His wife stood behind him, silent now, her certainty gone. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I took the letter from his hand and folded it carefully. I told him the truth in simple terms, that decisions had been made, that everything was legal, that I had taken steps to secure my future. I did not justify myself. I did not argue. I spoke calmly, as if explaining something obvious that had simply been overlooked. The room went quiet. My son stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. His wife's face tightened, her composure slipping. Questions turned into accusations, accusations into disbelief. I remained still. I realized then how accustomed they were to my compliance, how shocking it was for them to encounter my resolve. The shift in power was immediate and unmistakable. That night I lay awake listening to the house react. Doors closed harder than necessary, voices were raised, then hushed. I did not intervene. I had done enough intervening for one lifetime. As I stared at the ceiling, I understood that there was no undoing what I had set in motion. The truth was out now, exposed not through anger or confrontation, but through action. And while I did not yet know exactly how the aftermath would unfold, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had chosen myself, and that choice, once made, could not be taken back. The truth did not explode the way people imagine these things do. It landed, heavy, quiet, final. After the bank confirmed what the documents already said, after the lawyer's calm voice finished explaining what could not be undone, there was no shouting on the other end of the line. There was a long pause. Then Jason asked a question that told me everything I needed to know. He didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't ask where I was. He asked how long ago I had done it. I answered honestly. I had learned there was no point in softening facts anymore. Another silence followed. I could hear his breathing, uneven, restrained, like someone trying to hold a door shut against a force stronger than them. When he finally spoke again, his voice was not angry. It was confused. He said my name the way he used to when he was a child and couldn't find me in a store. For a brief moment, my body reacted before my mind could stop it. My chest tightened, my hands trembled, but I did not move toward him. I stayed where I was. He said I had embarrassed him. He said his wife's family was asking questions. He said people were talking. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he ask why I had felt the need to protect myself. That was when I understood that even now, even after everything, he still believed this was something that had happened to him. I listened until he ran out of words. Then I told him I would not be discussing it further. I wished him well, and I ended the call. That was the last real conversation we ever had. The days that followed were heavy. Not with regret, but with consequence. I could feel the shift in the air, like a storm had passed, but the ground was still wet. Messages came indirectly, a cousin asking if I was feeling unwell, an old neighbor wondering if I had moved temporarily. I answered politely and vaguely. I had no desire to defend myself. People who wanted to understand would, people who didn't were no longer my responsibility. What surprised me most was not Jason's reaction, but my own. I had expected guilt to consume me. I had expected sleepless nights, second-guessing, a constant urge to fix what I had broken. Instead, what I felt was a deep, unfamiliar exhaustion, the kind that comes after a long illness when the fever finally breaks. My body was tired of holding itself together under pressure. My mind was tired of anticipating harm. I slept more than I had in years. When I woke up, the world felt quieter, but not empty. I stayed away on purpose. I did not drive past the old house. I did not ask anyone what it looked like now. I did not want my resolve tested by nostalgia. I knew myself well enough to know that seeing familiar walls could soften my memory, and softened memories are dangerous. They blur truth. They invite doubt. I needed clarity, not comfort. Still, there were moments when the weight of separation pressed down on me. Not separation from the house or the money or even the role I had played for so long. It was the separation of the idea of who my son was supposed to be. That loss felt quiet and constant, like a low ache that never fully left. I allowed myself to feel it without letting it decide my future. Grief does not mean you were wrong, it means you cared. Through scattered updates, I learned that the plan they had made unraveled quickly. Without the certainty of my home, the conversations shifted. Tension replaced confidence. Accusations replaced assumptions. I did not take satisfaction in this. I noted it the way one notes the weather. Cause and effect, nothing more. Their choices had relied on my silence. Without it, they were exposed to each other. I moved carefully during that time, as if any sudden motion might send me backward. I chose neutral spaces, temporary places, locations with no emotional history attached to them. I watched myself closely, noticing how often I still flinched at unexpected sounds, how instinctively I minimized my needs. Healing, I learned, is not an instant transformation. It is repetition, choosing differently again and again until the body believes what the mind already knows. There were nights when fear returned, fear of being alone for too long, fear of aging without a safety net, fear that independence might someday turn into isolation. When those fears surfaced, I did not argue with them. I reminded myself that staying had not protected me from any of those things. It had only delayed them while costing me my dignity. Leaving had not created risk. It had revealed it and given me the chance to respond. One afternoon, while sorting through my belongings, I came across an envelope I had forgotten. Inside was a handwritten note I had once written to myself and never finished. It was from years ago, written during a moment of quiet despair. The sentence stopped halfway. I read it several times. Then I folded the paper and threw it away. I no longer needed reminders of who I had been when I believed endurance was the same as love. By the end of that period, something inside me had settled. Not peace, not yet, but stability. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. The separation was real now, irreversible, and fully understood on both sides. There would be no dramatic reunion, no late apology that changed everything. That door closed, not with anger, but with intention. Standing alone one evening, looking out at a city that did not know my past, I felt the weight of what I had done and what it had cost me. I also felt the quiet strength of what remained. I was still here, still thinking clearly, still capable of building something honest. The next chapter had not begun yet, but the old one was finally over, and for the first time, I was not afraid of what came next. The life that followed did not announce itself as a reward. It arrived slowly, without ceremony, like a season changing when you are no longer paying attention to the calendar. By the time I realized I was no longer living in survival mode, the shift had already taken place. My days had weight again, but not the crushing kind. They had shape, beginning, middle, end, and I was present for all of it. I settled into a small apartment in a part of the city where no one knew my history. The building was ordinary, the walls were thin, the hallway lights flickered sometimes, but when I closed my door at night, there was no tension waiting for me on the other side, no unspoken demands, no calculations about what I owed simply for existing. That absence felt strange at first. Then it felt like air. I began my mornings quietly, coffee by the window, not rushing, not preparing myself for conflict, just observing the world as it moved without me needing to manage it. I noticed how different my body felt when it wasn't bracing for the next request, the next criticism disguised as concern. My shoulders dropped, my breathing slowed. I stopped clenching my jaw without realizing I had been doing it for years. I took a class at the community center, crafts at first, then a book group. I didn't go there looking for connection. I went because I wanted somewhere to be that wasn't defined by my caste. The friendships that formed were gentle and unforced. No one needed anything from me beyond conversation. No one measured my worth by what I could provide. That was new, and it taught me something important. I had not been difficult to love. I had simply been surrounded by people who confused access with entitlement. Occasionally, news reached me. Not directly, it never was. I heard that Jason struggled after everything fell apart, that the confidence he once carried had thinned into something quieter and more cautious, that the people who once planned so comfortably around my absence were now busy managing their own consequences. I felt no satisfaction in this, only distance. Their lives were no longer connected to mine in any meaningful way. The bond had broken not because I left, but because it had already been hollow. There were moments when the maternal instinct resurfaced. It never disappears completely. A thought would cross my mind, wondering if he was eating well, if he was sleeping enough, if he ever paused and understood what he had lost. Those thoughts came and went. They no longer dictated my actions. Caring does not require self-destruction. I learned that too late for the relationship, but not too late for myself. My apartment filled slowly with things that brought me quiet joy, plants in the windows, books stacked next to a chair I claimed as my own, photographs of places I had visited after leaving, not to prove anything, but because I had been curious. I realized I had lived most of my life postponing curiosity. There was always someone else's needs to meet first. Now curiosity felt like permission. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box, I found photographs of Jason as a child. I sat on the floor and looked at them one by one. I didn't cry the way I once would have. The sadness was softer now, less sharp. I mourned the version of him I had known and the future I had imagined, but I no longer questioned my decision. Love that requires silence in the face of harm is not love that can be sustained. I understood something else during that time. Leaving did not make me strong. I had always been strong. Leaving simply revealed it. Strength is often mistaken for endurance, for staying, for absorbing pain quietly. But real strength is knowing when staying will cost you your identity. I had paid that price for too long. I began walking in the mornings, just around the neighborhood, nothing ambitious. During those walks, I thought about the years I had spent shrinking, convincing myself that patience was virtue even when it erased me. I thought about how many times I had apologized for asking for basic respect. Those thoughts no longer filled me with anger, they filled me with resolve. Never again. There was no reconciliation, no final conversation that brought closure in the way stories often promise. Closure did not come from him, it came from clarity, from accepting that some relationships end not because one person fails, but because continuing would require one person to disappear. I chose not to disappear. As time passed, peace became less fragile. It stopped feeling like something I had to protect constantly and started feeling like something I inhabited naturally. I laughed more easily. I slept deeply. I trusted my instincts again. That trust was the greatest thing I reclaimed. If I could speak to the woman I was before all of this, the one who hesitated, who doubted herself, who believed love meant tolerating harm, I would tell her this: you are not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not selfish for refusing to be used. And you are not alone just because you walk away from people who never truly saw you. I am 68 years old. I did not start over to prove a point. I started over because I wanted to live the years I have left without fear, without manipulation, without shrinking. And I succeeded. My life now is simple, quiet, mine. No one conspires to take it. No one benefits from my silence. I wake up each day knowing that what I have cannot be stolen because it is not built on sacrifice anymore. It is built on dignity. I lost a son the day I saw him clearly. I gained myself the day I chose not to look away.